Hello, Patrick Costello. Nice talking to you. Thank you for joining us on the Quaker Council for European Affairs series of interviews on the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security, with a special focus on democracy and good governance. You are head of division on democracy and electoral observation at the European External Action Service. As you may know, our report, Building Peace Together, actually talks of elections as a non-violent means for managing conflicting political views around the world. So I'm wondering, in these difficult circumstances today, if you might just introduce briefly your office before we get a bit of a sense of a state of play.
Sure, and good afternoon, Olivia, and thanks very much for taking the time. I think maybe just to explain, our main job is normally to observe elections all over the world. That is to say, everywhere except OSCE member countries, where we have an arrangement with the OSCE that they observe those. But in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, we would normally be observing a number of elections at this time. And of course, many of them have been postponed. And in some cases, we've had to repatriate missions. So we're not in a position to do that. We also have responsibility for the general policy on democracy, which of course is much wider than just the elections and the election observation itself. So that's kind of what we do.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could give us just a brief overview, like a state of play. Where are we in terms of elections being postponed in the world? And where are we in terms of EU missions that were supposed to be observing them, not being able to do it anymore?
Sure. Well, there are to date around 48 elections in different countries and territories around the world that have been postponed. Very different kinds, some presidential, some referenda, some legislative, local, etc. But it's quite a dramatic figure. And I think it's perhaps important to add that in addition to that, in more than 50 countries, states of emergency have been declared in order to deal with the pandemic. And that also has major implications for things like democratic scrutiny, civic space, etc. So this is obviously having a major effect. And we've had to repatriate, most recently, a full observation mission from Guyana, which is still in the middle of a very contested electoral process with certain risks of violence, where a recount is going on, which we're not able to observe. We were supposed to be deploying to Sri Lanka. The legislative elections there have been postponed from 25th of April. There's a new date been announced in June, but that's also being contested judicially. And we don't know if it will be possible by June, which would mean us deploying our observers several weeks before Election Day. Whether that will be possible at that time. At the moment, it's not possible for people to go in. The other major one that we were supposed to be observing in is Bolivia. Again, the election's been postponed. There's no clear date fixed yet, because there's not yet a clear political consensus around how to move ahead. So we're watching very closely and looking at what's feasible and possible.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit on some of the risks around postponing elections and what the EU might be thinking of doing in terms of prevention mechanisms. I'm thinking, of course, of the risk of violence, but also narrowing of political space.
Sure. I mean, there's been some work done by different organizations on looking at, if you like, providing guidance on where it is necessary to postpone an election. In this kind of crisis, it's absolutely normal to reduce the health risks, and the right to health and the right to life have to take first priority. But for example, it is extremely important, if an election is postponed, that that is done with a level of consensus among all the electoral stakeholders involved, and that includes all the political parties, but it also includes the administrative bodies involved, and it also includes civil society. One recommendation is that if an election is to be postponed, it would be much better if that is achieved through a piece of legislation, because that would then imply opposition parties, buying into this process of that this is necessary, rather than it being seen as an executive power grab, which in some cases it can be.
Crisis Group published a report on 7 trends around the impact of COVID-19 on conflicts. They have some recommendations, such as declarations of extra electoral assistance once the disease subsides, or quiet diplomacy between parties. Are these type of initiatives that you think, if not the EU, but civil society could do and could sort of prevent some violence around postponing elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important in all the assistance that is done to countries to help countries to deal with the consequences of the pandemic, that full attention is paid to the human rights, democracy, conflict sensitive aspects of it. I mean, the EU adopted last week a 15.6 billion package, which is absolutely enormous to help countries around the world. And obviously, there is an absolute urgency in getting this money out into the field quickly and at the time when it's needed. But at the same time, it's extremely important that when looking at particularly at things like budget support, which is the fastest way of delivering money, that we don't inadvertently contribute to either strengthening authoritarian governments who might divert money, or increasing the risks that money is used in ways that can exacerbate existing conflicts on the ground. And that those concerns have to be balanced against the urgency of getting the money out into the field. And I think that civil society organizations can play a really important role in watching this closely and telling us when they think, no, this is going wrong, or advising on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Turning to democracy more at large, I was wondering if you could share some of your analysis on other risks that this health crisis might be posing. We had discussed the Carnegie report that actually outlines some of the reduction of space of media, freedom of expression, etc. But I'm wondering if you have some other analysis on some of the risks.
Sure. I mean, I think what's extremely tricky in this is that in order to implement measures such as lockdowns, etc., or postponing elections, all those things, that inevitably requires a certain derogation of certain freedoms. Freedom to move around, for a start. And of course, that also creates an opportunity for governments, authoritarian governments, to use that to increase their unchecked power, basically, and to contribute further to democratic backsliding. And of course, this is in a context where even before the crisis, democracy was in decline globally. So we now have less than half countries in the world are democracies. And there is a risk that the measures introduced to deal with the crisis could accelerate that trend. I think one of the things that it's extremely important to look at are the international legal provisions in relations to state of emergency. There is nothing at all wrong. In fact, it's absolutely necessary to invoke states of emergency to deal with this kind of crisis. But it has to be done in certain ways. Only certain rights can be derogated, and any measures that are taken need to be necessary they need to be proportionate in scope, and they need to be time limited, precisely to avoid those kind of abuses. And I think it's extremely important at this moment to have a very close eye on the way in which measures are being introduced by countries, to make sure that we don't have these kind of medium-term consequences. Added to which there is a more medium-term, long-term risk in relation to democracy, which is that we know the ILO, for example, estimated at the beginning of March that there will be, by the end of this year, something like 28 million additional unemployed. And the Secretary General of the ILO said at the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank last week that that number may well be a very large underestimate. Now, if we're talking about that kind of social impact of this crisis, the likelihood is that that risks generating a big boost for populist and anti-democratic politics, and it increases the risks of conflict inevitably, because the inequalities that that kind of economic impact generates will cause very, very big difficulties around the world.
Are there any countries around the world that are of specific concern to you on the democracy side, but maybe also on the election side?
There are a number of quite significant elections where there are big risks of conflict which are coming up in the next period. Ethiopia is an extremely important one. Although there is at least some good news. They've postponed the election, which, given the state of preparedness before the crisis, is probably quite a good thing. And also, they've declared a state of emergency, but unlike in previous states of emergency in Ethiopia, they haven't given the security forces additional powers to enforce it, which is quite encouraging, and it certainly suggests that the state is quite keen on playing the democratic game fairly. But there are enormous risks there. Côte d'Ivoire is another one later this year where no sign of postponement at this stage, although it may well be postponed. We're again following closely, but again, very big risks of it being a very, very conflictual election. And although it's encouraging that President Ouattara has decided that he's not going to stand himself, it's still rather clear that there may be a situation where the playing field is not perhaps as level as it should be, and that could create all sorts of tensions in the country in the run-up. But we'll have to see. So, yeah.
Thank you. To finish on a positive note, if it is at all possible, I'm wondering if there are any silver linings from COVID-19 on democracy and good governance. You mentioned Ethiopia. Are there other examples or trends that you are observing that might be positive outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the picture is, the challenges are enormous, but I think the picture of how countries have reacted is an extremely mixed one, and you can pick out some good examples. I mentioned Ethiopia, another one. A number of countries actually have been asking, where they've been using the military to implement some of the measures in relation to dealing with the crisis, have been asking our delegations for advice on how to do it whilst respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, which is encouraging. You have the health minister in Sierra Leone recently came out quite strongly against the idea that patients with COVID should be identified. And this again runs very, very counter to some countries where names and addresses of people who are quarantined are being published on official government websites. So that sort of defense of privacy in this context is quite important. So there are some small good signs, but I have to say it's within an overall picture which is worrying. And one has to remain clear-headed about a pessimistic analysis in order to be able to address it, because otherwise we'll be very surprised when things develop in the coming year. So not an over-happy picture, but I think there are some little bright spots in places.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks for taking part in this series, and I look forward to staying in touch.